Since its founding in 1948, Israel has faced numerous accusations of violating international criminal law, including war crimes, crimes against humanity, and even genocide. These allegations stem from a wide range of actions, such as targeting civilians, collective punishment, and indiscriminate attacks. Over the decades, international organizations, human rights groups, and the United Nations have documented and investigated these incidents. This video will guide you through the major events, patterns, and legal implications surrounding Israeli war crimes, providing a comprehensive overview of the historical and ongoing controversies. As we move through each era, we'll examine key incidents, the responses from the global community, and the impact on civilians. Let's begin by understanding the foundation of these allegations and the international laws involved. War crimes are serious violations of international humanitarian law, including acts like targeting civilians, torture, and collective punishment. Israel ratified the Geneva Conventions in 1951, which set the standards for the treatment of civilians and combatants during conflict. In 2015, the State of Palestine acceded to the Rome Statute, granting the International Criminal Court (ICC) jurisdiction over alleged crimes in the occupied Palestinian territories. Over the years, special rapporteurs, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and other organizations have accused Israel of breaching these laws. The ICC and United Nations have launched multiple investigations, though Israel has often refused to cooperate. Understanding these legal frameworks is crucial to grasping the gravity of the allegations and the international response. The period from 1948 to 1966 saw the establishment of Israel and the first major wave of violence. During the 1948 Palestine War, around 700,000 Palestinian Arabs were expelled or fled from their homes, with many historians describing these events as ethnic cleansing. Numerous massacres occurred, including the Tanshura, Lida Deir Yassin, and Al-Dawiyama incidents, where hundreds of civilians were killed. Israeli forces were also accused of rape, destruction of villages, and psychological warfare. These events set the stage for decades of conflict and are often cited as foundational examples of alleged Israeli war crimes. The trauma and displacement from this era continue to influence the Israeli-Palestinian conflict today. The years following Israel's founding, a series of violent reprisals and massacres occurred in the West Bank and Gaza. Notable incidents include the Beit Jala massacre, where Israeli forces demolished homes and killed civilians in retaliation for earlier attacks. The Buraj Camp massacre saw Unit 101, led by Ariel Sharon, kill at least 20 civilians in a refugee camp. Kibbutz massacre resulted in the deaths of 69 villagers, mostly women and children, and widespread destruction of property. These operations were condemned internationally, with the United Nations and Western governments calling for accountability. Such events highlighted the cycle of violence and the targeting of civilians, further fueling tensions in the region. 1956 Suez Crisis marked another escalation, with Israel invading the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip. During this campaign, Israeli forces carried out mass killings in Khan Yunis and Rafah, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of Palestinian civilians. Reports from the United Nations and eyewitnesses described summary executions, use of human shields, and indiscriminate violence. Kafr Qasim massacre, where 49 civilians were killed for violating a curfew they were unaware of, shocked the world and led to widespread outrage. These incidents underscored the persistent risks faced by civilians during military operations and the challenges of enforcing international law in conflict zones. 1967 Six-Day War brought further allegations of war crimes. Israeli forces were accused of killing surrendering Egyptian soldiers and civilians, with mass graves discovered years later. The war also led to the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians and Syrians, and the destruction of entire villages. Testimonies from Israeli soldiers and journalists revealed a pattern of summary executions and disregard for the laws of war. These actions not only deepened the humanitarian crisis but also set a precedent for future conflicts, raising questions about military conduct and accountability. During the War of Attrition 1967–1970, Israeli airstrikes targeted civilian infrastructure in Egypt, including the Abu Zabal metal factory and the Bar el-Bakr primary school. These attacks resulted in the deaths of dozens of workers and children, drawing international condemnation. Israel often claimed military necessity, but investigations by human rights organizations and the United Nations found little justification for targeting non-military sites. The deliberate or reckless targeting of civilians and essential infrastructure became a recurring theme in subsequent conflicts. 1982 Lebanon War saw Israel invade Lebanon, leading to the infamous Sabra and Shatila massacre. While Lebanese militias carried out the killings, Israeli forces surrounded the camps and failed to intervene, making them complicit in the deaths of hundreds to thousands of civilians. The United Nations General Assembly condemned the massacre as an act of genocide, and subsequent inquiries found Israel indirectly responsible. The events in Lebanon highlighted the devastating consequences of military occupation and the importance of protecting civilian populations during wartime. After withdrawing from Beirut, Israel continued to occupy southern Lebanon for nearly 2 decades. This period was marked by ongoing conflict with Hezbollah and other groups, as well as repeated incidents of violence against civilians. The Somer massacre, Operation Accountability, and Operation Grapes of Wrath resulted in the deaths and displacement of thousands of Lebanese and Palestinian civilians. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International documented attacks on civilian targets, use of banned munitions, and collective punishment. These operations further entrenched the cycle of violence and raised serious legal and ethical concerns. First Intifada, late 1980s, was a period of widespread Palestinian uprising against Israeli occupation. Israeli forces responded with curfews, mass arrests, and the use of live ammunition against stone-throwing youths. Notable incidents include the Nehalin raid and the 1990 Temple Mount killings, where dozens of Palestinians were killed and hundreds injured. Human rights organizations condemned the excessive and disproportionate use of force, as well as collective punishment measures like village-wide curfews. These actions were widely seen as violations of international humanitarian law and further fueled resentment and resistance. Second Intifada 2000-2005 saw a dramatic escalation in violence, with Israeli forces conducting large-scale military operations in Palestinian cities and refugee camps. The Battle of Jenin became a flashpoint, with allegations of massacres, house demolitions, and the use of armored bulldozers. Human rights groups accused Israel of war crimes, including blocking medical care, using human shields, and arbitrary detention. While some claims were later revised, the widespread destruction and civilian suffering left a lasting impact on the region and intensified calls for accountability. 2006, Israel invaded Gaza in response to the capture of an Israeli soldier. The conflict resulted in significant civilian casualties and widespread destruction. Human rights organizations reported indiscriminate attacks, the use of Palestinian civilians as human shields, and the targeting of civilian infrastructure such as Gaza's only power plant. These actions were widely condemned as war crimes, with calls for investigations and reparation. The conflict set a precedent for future confrontations in Gaza, highlighting the persistent dangers faced by civilians in densely populated areas. 2006 Lebanon war between Israel and Hezbollah resulted in over 1,000 Lebanese deaths, most of them civilians. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International documented widespread use of cluster munitions, attacks on civilian objects, and collective punishment. The destruction of homes, schools, and infrastructure left lasting scars on Lebanese society. The international community called for investigations into potential war crimes, but accountability remained elusive. This conflict underscored the devastating impact of modern warfare on civilian populations and the challenges of enforcing humanitarian law. Operation Cast Lead in Gaza saw Israeli forces launch a massive military campaign, resulting in heavy civilian casualties and destruction. The United Nations fact-finding mission found evidence of collective punishment, disproportionate force, and the use of white phosphorus in populated areas. Human rights groups reported the use of human shields, attacks on hospitals and schools, and deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure. While Israel claimed military necessity, the scale and intensity of the attacks led to widespread condemnation and calls for war crimes investigations. During the 2008-2009 Gaza war, Israeli forces were accused of using Palestinian civilians as human shields, forcing them to enter buildings ahead of soldiers or accompany troops during searches. The extensive use of white phosphorus munitions in densely populated areas caused severe burns and deaths, drawing international condemnation. Investigations by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International concluded that these actions constituted war crime. Despite some prosecutions and disciplinary actions within the Israeli military, many incidents went unpunished, fueling ongoing demands for accountability. Destruction of civilian infrastructure, including power plants, water facilities, and hospitals, became a hallmark of Israeli military operations in Gaza. Journalists covering the conflict were also targeted, with several killed or injured in airstrikes. The intentional targeting of media workers is considered a war crime under international law. Human rights organizations and press freedom groups called for investigations, but accountability remained limited. These attacks not only hindered humanitarian relief but also restricted independent reporting from conflict zones. 2014 Gaza war saw unprecedented destruction, with thousands of homes demolished and entire neighborhoods leveled. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International documented numerous cases where families were killed in their homes, often without effective warning. The shelling of UNRWA schools sheltering displaced civilians resulted in dozens of deaths, drawing condemnation from the United Nations. The widespread targeting of residential areas and civilian infrastructure raised serious concerns about proportionality and the protection of non-combatants in armed conflict. International humanitarian law requires effective advance warning before attacks that may affect civilians. During the 2014 Gaza war, Israel often issued warnings via phone calls, leaflets, or roof knocks. However, human rights groups found these warnings were frequently ineffective, with insufficient time or safe routes for evacuation. Many civilians remained in their homes due to lack of alternatives, and attacks sometimes followed warnings by only minutes. The failure to provide meaningful protection for civilians during military operations remains a critical issue in the ongoing conflict. Medical neutrality is a cornerstone of international humanitarian law, protecting hospitals, ambulances, and medical personnel during conflict. In Gaza, numerous reports emerged of Israeli forces targeting ambulances and health facilities with airstrikes, resulting in the deaths of medical workers and patients. World Health Organization and other agencies condemned these attacks, emphasizing that denying medical care and targeting health infrastructure are prohibited under international law. The destruction of Gaza's healthcare system has had devastating consequences for civilians, especially during periods of intense fighting. Israeli-Palestinian conflict has become one of the deadliest for journalists in the 21st century. During recent wars, dozens of journalists have been killed, many while clearly identified as press. Media offices and broadcasting stations have also been targeted, often justified by claims of propaganda or military use. International organizations, including Reporters Without Borders and the Committee to Protect Journalists, have called these attacks war crime. The loss of independent reporting not only endangers journalists but also deprives the world of critical information about the realities on the ground. During the 2015-2016 wave of violence, Israeli security forces were accused of extrajudicial executions, particularly at checkpoints and in urban areas. Human rights organizations documented cases where Palestinians were shot after no longer posing a threat, or while already wounded. The killings of Hadil al-Hashlamon and Abdul Fattah al-Sharif became emblematic of this pattern. These incidents raised concerns about a culture of impunity and the use of lethal force as a first resort rather than as a last measure. Calls for accountability and reform have persisted, but challenges remain. Throughout the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the use of excessive force by Israeli security forces has been a recurring issue. Human Rights Watch and the United Nations have documented hundreds of cases where lethal force was used against protesters, bystanders, and suspected assailants, often when non-lethal measures were available. The high number of injuries and deaths among civilians, including children, has drawn international criticism. These patterns highlight the urgent need for adherence to the principles of necessity and proportionality in law enforcement and military operations. 2018-2019 Gaza border protests, known as the Great March of Return, saw thousands of Palestinians demonstrate near the Israeli border. Israeli forces responded with live ammunition, resulting in hundreds of deaths and thousands of injuries. A United Nations commission found that only a small fraction of the cases analyzed were possibly justified as responses to danger. The majority of shootings were deemed unlawful, potentially constituting war crimes and crimes against humanity. The high toll on civilians, including medics and journalists, underscored the urgent need for accountability and restraint. In recent years, periodic clashes between Israel and Palestinian groups in Gaza have resulted in significant civilian casualties. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have documented airstrikes on homes, workplaces, and public spaces that lacked clear military objectives or caused disproportionate harm. The deaths of entire families, including children, have become tragically common. These incidents have intensified calls for independent investigations and greater protection for civilians during hostilities. 2021 and 2022 escalations in Gaza saw renewed allegations of war crimes, with Israeli airstrikes killing dozens of civilians, including women and children. Human rights organizations accused Israel of targeting residential buildings and failing to provide effective warnings. The International Criminal Court opened investigations into these incidents, though Israel disputed the allegation. The ongoing cycle of violence and lack of accountability continue to fuel mistrust and suffering on both sides. The ongoing Gaza war since 2023 has resulted in tens of thousands of Palestinian deaths, with women and children making up the majority of victims. The United Nations, human rights groups, and the International Criminal Court have all raised concerns about potential war crimes, including collective punishment, starvation, and indiscriminate attacks. The international response has included calls for ceasefires, humanitarian aid, and accountability for violations of international law. The scale and intensity of the conflict have brought unprecedented attention to the plight of civilians in Gaza. One of the most serious allegations against Israel is the use of collective punishment, particularly through the blockade of Gaza. By cutting off electricity, water, food, and medical supplies, Israel has been accused of intentionally inflicting suffering on the civilian population. International law prohibits collective punishment, and organizations like Doctors Without Borders and the United Nations have described the situation as a humanitarian catastrophe. The blockade has led to widespread malnutrition, disease, and psychological trauma, especially among children. Deliberate use of starvation as a method of warfare is considered a war crime under international law. In Gaza, the blockade and destruction of food supplies, water infrastructure, and agricultural land have led to severe food insecurity and famine. Human Rights Watch, Oxfam, and UN officials have accused Israel of using starvation to force the population into submission. The impact on children has been especially devastating, with high rates of malnutrition, anemia, and preventable diseases. The international community continues to demand an end to these practices and the restoration of humanitarian access. Forced evacuation of civilians, particularly the 2023 order for 1.1 million people to leave northern Gaza, has been characterized as a forcible transfer, a crime against humanity. International law prohibits the organized removal of civilian populations except for their own safety. The mass displacement in Gaza has led to overcrowded shelters, lack of basic necessities, and increased vulnerability to disease and violence. Human rights experts warn that such actions may amount to ethnic cleansing and call for urgent protection of displaced populations. Use of white phosphorus munitions in populated areas has been repeatedly documented in Gaza and Lebanon. These weapons cause severe burns and fires, posing a grave risk to civilians. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have verified multiple incidents where white phosphorus was used unlawfully, resulting in civilian injuries and environmental destruction. The deployment of such weapons in residential neighborhoods is widely condemned as a war crime, and calls for international bans have intensified. Israeli airstrikes on densely populated refugee camps, such as al-Shadi and Jabalia, have resulted in mass civilian casualties and the destruction of homes, markets, and places of worship. These attacks often lack clear military objectives and are considered indiscriminate under international law. The targeting of UNRWA schools and shelters where displaced families sought refuge has drawn particular outrage. The United Nations and human rights groups have called for investigations into these incidents as potential war crimes. Destruction of religious and cultural heritage sites, including mosques, churches, and ancient monuments, has been a recurring feature of the conflict. The bombing of the Church of St. Porphyrius and the Great Ammari Mosque in Gaza are recent examples. Such attacks not only violate international law but also erode the cultural identity and history of affected communities. The loss of archives, artifacts, and places of worship has been described as cultural genocide by scholars and human rights advocates. One of the most shocking recent incidents was the so-called Flower Massacre, where Israeli forces opened fire on civilians waiting for food aid in Gaza, killing over 100 people. Similar attacks on aid distribution points have resulted in dozens of deaths and injuries. Humanitarian organizations and the United Nations have condemned these actions as violations of international humanitarian law, emphasizing the right of civilians to receive life-saving assistance during conflict. April 2024, Israeli drone strikes killed 7 aid workers from World Central Kitchen, who were distributing food in northern Gaza. This incident brought the total number of aid workers killed to nearly 200 since the start of the war. The deliberate targeting of humanitarian convoys is a grave violation of international law, and the international community has demanded accountability. Militarization of aid delivery has made humanitarian work in Gaza extremely dangerous and complicated relief efforts. Nuseirat refugee camp became the site of a devastating Israeli operation in June 2024, aimed at rescuing hostages. While 4 hostages were freed, the operation involved intense airstrikes and ground assaults, resulting in the deaths of over 270 Palestinians and injuries to hundreds more. The widespread destruction and high civilian toll sparked international condemnation and renewed calls for adherence to the laws of war, even during hostage rescue missions. In March 2025, Israel resumed large-scale airstrikes in Gaza, ending a 2-month ceasefire and killing over 400 Palestinians in a single day. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International condemned the attacks as violations of international law, citing the deaths of civilians, destruction of hospitals, and denial of humanitarian aid. The repeated breaches of ceasefire agreements have undermined efforts to achieve lasting peace and have perpetuated the cycle of violence and suffering. Attacks on medical personnel, ambulances, and hospitals have been a persistent feature of the conflict. In March 2025, Israeli forces killed at least 15 medical workers in Rafah, including members of the Palestinian Red Crescent and UN staff. The deliberate targeting and destruction of health facilities are considered war crimes and have been condemned by the World Health Organization and the United Nations. The collapse of Gaza's healthcare system has left countless civilians without access to life-saving treatment. Reports have emerged of Israeli soldiers looting Palestinian homes in Gaza, taking valuables and destroying property. The Fourth Geneva Convention explicitly prohibits pillage and the destruction of civilian property during wartime. Despite some internal investigations, accountability for these actions has been limited. The widespread looting and vandalism have deepened the sense of injustice and loss among affected families, compounding the humanitarian crisis. Numerous reports have documented the summary execution of unarmed Palestinians, including those attempting to surrender or waving white flags. Human rights groups have also revealed the existence of kill zones in Gaza, where anyone crossing certain lines is shot on sight. These practices violate the fundamental principles of international humanitarian law, which protect persons forced to combat and prohibit arbitrary killings. The lack of accountability for such actions remains a major concern. Footage and eyewitness accounts have shown Israeli forces killing Palestinians and even Israeli hostages who were attempting to surrender. The killing of persons who have laid down their arms or are otherwise forced to combat is strictly prohibited under the laws of war. These incidents have sparked outrage both domestically and internationally, with calls for thorough investigations and justice for the victims. The repeated occurrence of such killings highlights the urgent need for reforms in military engagement protocols. Enforced disappearance of Palestinian men, women, and children has been widely reported, with thousands detained without due process. Many detainees have faced ill treatment, torture, and denial of legal representation. Enforced disappearance is a war crime and, when systematic, a crime against humanity. Human rights organizations have called on Israel to disclose the whereabouts of detainees, ensure humane treatment, and provide access to legal counsel. The psychological and social impact of these disappearances is profound and long-lasting. Video evidence and testimonies have revealed the widespread abuse and sexual humiliation of Palestinian detainees by Israeli forces. Detainees have been stripped naked, beaten, and subjected to degrading treatment, including sexual insults and physical assault. Such acts are clear violations of international law and constitute torture and inhumane treatment. The United Nations and human rights groups have called for independent investigations and accountability for these abuses. Reports from the United Nations and Physicians for Human Rights have documented cases of sexual violence against Palestinian detainees, including rape and forced nudity. Both men and women have been subjected to these abuses, which are used as tools of punishment and intimidation. Sexual violence in conflict is a grave breach of international law and is recognized as both a war crime and a crime against humanity. The psychological trauma inflicted on survivors is immense, and the need for justice and support is urgent. Israeli forces have been accused of engaging in perfidy, deceiving the enemy by feigning civilian or medical status to carry out attacks. Notably, undercover operations in hospitals have resulted in the killing of suspects while disguised as medics or patients. Additionally, the use of Palestinian civilians as human shields continues to be reported, with individuals forced to accompany soldiers or enter dangerous areas first. Both practices are prohibited under international law and are considered war crimes. Scale and intensity of violence in Gaza have led to growing accusations of genocide against Israel. Hundreds of legal scholars, human rights organizations, and the United Nations have warned that Israeli actions may meet the legal definition of genocide. In December 2023, South Africa filed a case at the International Court of Justice, alleging violations of the Genocide Convention. The ICC has also issued arrest warrants for Israeli leaders on charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity. These developments mark a significant escalation in international efforts to hold perpetrators accountable and seek justice for victims.